Episode 15, Threshold Training.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Patterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. So in today's episode, Phil and I discuss training the secondary threshold. So that's FTP, critical power, critical velocity, MLSS. So we dig into, some of the methods that have been used out there. Also, we kind of narrow down some of the protocols where you might start from, depending on where you're at. Also, things to take in consideration when you're programming, training for this threshold. Also, we discuss, how the literature kind of goes about researching this topic, because there's not a lot of direct research on specifically training the secondary threshold in North America. So we have to deduce from research, which we get into how to do that and understand, how to understand what a stimulus is being kind of applied. So yeah, if you guys are liking the episodes, just let us know. Also, let us know what we can do to improve them. You can find Phil at Critical02 on Instagram. You can find myself at Resilience HPC, and hope you enjoy.
All right, there we go. Yeah, so we're just going to jump into it. So Matt and I we want to focus this episode on threshold interventions and how, or just exercise training interventions and how they generally change threshold. Either LT1, which is kind of like that zone 2 area, or LT2, VT2, whatever nomenclature you want to use, which is kind of that upper end. So yeah, Matt, go ahead. I cut you off, and now I'm going to bring you back into it.
Yeah, it's funny because when you think about exercise physiology, you think about, research for sport performance. How do we get better? But when you actually look at the amount of studies dedicated to understanding the differences between different training interventions to improve, whether it's your lactate threshold, like your first lactate threshold, or maybe your MLSS or critical power, or whatever you want to use, there's very little. And I've gone through this process a couple times now of scanning through the research and coming up empty-handed. Like you find a few here and there where you generally have to infer from, because whether it's not well-trained subjects, or maybe it's from a different sport. But yeah, it's actually really, really hard. And this is kind of like why I'm such a huge fan of some other research countries that do other research. It's where it has been focused on this stuff, like in Eastern Bloc countries.
Whereas, right. And you're not finding any of that research on PubMed.
Yeah, you're not finding it there. So yeah, that's just something I thought it'd be cool for people to understand. Is like, yeah, there's probably quite a bit out there on VO2 max. There's quite a bit out there on some basic cardiopulmonary measures. But when we're talking about training and elite athletes, it's hard. It's really hard to find stuff out there.
Yeah. So this is coming after I messaged Matt about, hey, do you have any research that actually shows that there's improvements in some of these measures, with different training modalities and other things like that? Because like him, I was kind of scouring like PubMed, Google Scholar, those sort of things, and like looking for comparisons, and I wasn't really finding anything. And I was like, oh, it must just be because I'm, not really familiar with the field. I haven't, been, keeping up on it. Because, I mean, if we go back to our, measures of performance paper, the Joyner and Coyle, paper or the review, they're like, oh, like lactate threshold 2 is extremely important for exercise performance. And it's like, okay, well, if it's extremely important for exercise performance, which we know it is, then it should be sensitive to different sort of training modalities and those sort of things. I think the big challenge is, and I think there was a paper by like Ustrand and Saltine like a long time ago, like a review paper that showed that early interventions really had a tendency to increase VO2 max. So this is in untrained individuals. And then it just takes time to accumulate mitochondrial proteins, get capillary reorganization and construction and all of that. So eventually you see adaptations to your threshold. So maybe one of the large limitations of trying to do these sort of studies is that it's really hard from a research perspective to get people to do, like a 12 to 36 week, like training intervention.
Yeah.
And especially in elite level athletes, because this is something we've talked about as well. Is like the research doesn't necessarily reflect how coaches actually implement training, right?
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't ever ask an elite or a coach would never have an elite level athlete just do 12 weeks of 1 day of high intensity interval training, 1 day of rest, and then just repeat that every other day. Like we know from practice that it just doesn't make sense because it doesn't maximize an athlete's potential. So on top of that, getting an athlete to agree then, to come and do something that they know is, may inherently not be optimized for their performance could probably be challenging. And, if you wanted to, do any sort of biochemical measurements, like muscle biopsies, other things like that, it's hard to get the general public to do that sort of thing, let alone like an elite level athlete who has to, then go out and race and do other things like that. Even though, from an invasive standpoint, it's not too bad. It feels like you have a Charlie horse after it. And, there's people who have gotten muscle biopsies in the middle of a marathon and continue to run the marathon. So it's completely possible. But again, it's like, taking a little bit of flesh from people. It's, people are not too keen on that. Anyways, that was a long diatribe about, to get to the point that we know from a coaching perspective that, pushing critical power, lactate threshold, all those sort of things is really important. But the challenge with the finding studies is that there just aren't too many out there. But you sent me some good ones, and I think we can kind of discuss it because it is interesting to see, like what people have done in terms of comparisons and all of that.
Let's start with the Jenkins and Quigley one, because that was kind of like a fairly nice paper that really just threw some endurance training. So the name of the paper is called Endurance Training Enhances Critical Power. So all they did was they took 12 healthy active subjects and they put them on 8 weeks of training. So first what they did was they tested their critical power, right? They tested their VO2 max. They gave them familiarization with the whole protocols and everything like that. And basically they wanted to see where are they starting at, right?
Yep.
So they did like the traditional 3. What do you want to say? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say you got it.
Yeah.
The 3 tests.
Yeah, the 3 tests for the critical power, which is, the kind of the gold standard. You can do more than that. You can do less. Some people do a 2 stage test where they do a 12-minute effort and like a 2-minute effort. You can do they're all over the place. You can do them any which way you desire, but generally the best way to do a critical power test is on a cycle ergometer where you have a specific wattage that you're trying to hold. And for these tests, they pick 270, 330, and 390. So they're not slouching for, average subjects, right? These guys aren't cyclists. So this is some hard work. And they go and have a crack at 270. They take a 3-hour break. They take a crack at 330 and then et cetera, right? So after this, they throw in the calculations and they get the critical power. And also what they do is they do a 40-minute exercise test at that critical power. So they wanted to actually see if they could hold that critical power for 40 minutes, right? And if they couldn't, they just reduced it by 6 watts essentially. And let's see how long they can go at this 6 watts and then kind of et cetera. So yeah, this is where they start from. And then they moved into the training program, right? So they had a group, right, of people that were basically control subjects that basically did nothing, right? They went about their normal activities. They weren't doing any type of structured training, anything like that. And then they took the training group, which they did 30 minutes of cycling. So they did this 3 times a week for 5 weeks, right? And they did this at their critical power, essentially. So the first critical power number that they got was the target, what they used for this. So that's hard work. 30
Oh yeah.
minutes at the first critical power.
Oh yeah.
That's, that's really, really hard work. And obviously, as time goes on, that gets easier as you're getting fitter. They're getting more familiar. They're getting more economical on the bike, to a slight degree. But yeah, so then they increased up that time till they get 35 minutes and then 40 minutes. So yeah, that's what the training intervention was essentially. And then after retesting all these things again, at the end of this training block, this 8 weeks, right? This is not a ton of time. It's 2 months of training. They had VO2 max increase of 8% compared to the control group, which had, let me see here. I think it was, the control group was like, they had basically nothing.
Yeah.
It wasn't, it was negligible. And
So
then they had
something to add real quick, Matt, is that a lot of people nowadays do not do this like sedentary control for like training studies and stuff, and that's a huge potential limitation, right? Because you don't know if if you're measuring proteins or other things like that, if things are fluctuating and people are just like maybe slowly increasing over time or things like that. So I think it's really important to note that I like this study design because they did have the control subjects basically to just say, look, nothing changed in them, which we'd expect not to, but at the same time, you can't take it for granted.
Yeah, and especially when you're thinking about a short study, right? If you're doing like let's just say a 6-week study, if someone's doing 7 tests, right, of like really, really hard exercise and getting quite familiar with exhaustion, with fatigue, and understanding their physical and mental and psychological thresholds, there's a good chance that those things might change if it's only 6 weeks time when they go to retest again and do another 6 or 7 tests, right?
Yeah.
So what you said there is actually super important, which a lot of people are like, oh, but it's just so hard to recruit people, right? So they're just trying to basically that's what we're kind of stuck with. And we have limitations of finance too. So
paying all or compensating participants for their time, that's a huge cost. And then too, if you again this kind of goes back to like if you're doing muscle biopsies or other things like that, right, you need to justify to your ethical board that something is worth
the money
doing, and it doesn't impose too much undue risk to the participant. So by having these sedentary controls, granted they weren't doing too much crazy invasive measures or anything like that, but that's something that I don't think in this day and age an IRB would approve of, just having a sedentary control population, especially if you're doing something that is maybe pharmacological or something along those lines that could have benefit.
We've seen that with some of the stuff lately. So that's a good point. Like exercise, like a lot of this exercise physiology, the investment in a lot of this is that really, if it has benefit to maybe any type of disease or any type of saving taxpayers dollars, this is a lot of where the funding comes down through the funnel is can this benefit our society or economy in some way? And professional athletes just don't really fit that portion of the puzzle that well.
So the translatability is really challenging.
Exactly. So this is a good tangent we went on for people just kind of here on that. So the big thing about this study was the real thing that was drawn out was a 30% increase in critical power, right?
That's awesome.
That's huge, right? For 8 weeks, 30% increase. So they went from, what was it? They went from 196 as a mean to 255, right? That's absolutely massive. So you know, if you're thinking about, oh, is this applicable to me as a cyclist? We're going to get into another study after they'll kind of highlight these things. As there's a rule of specificity when it comes to training. Obviously, we all know that, but realistically, when people talk about training FTP or critical power, and they get, oh, I don't want to be too high above FTP because then I'm gonna it's not going to be relevant to FTP. Well, what's above your FTP? Well, your critical power is like above
Right.
your FTP.
Right.
So do you think that's not going to benefit your critical power?
Yeah.
So people get really, really minute on these, like, oh, don't do this. And realistically, I understand where they're coming from. You
Right.
don't want to overshoot and try and do 60 minutes at 105% of your FTP,
Right.
right? Like that's going to cook you.
Right.
But just because, you're not in the right category, generally, if you're just paying attention to RPE and understanding how close you are to that limit of like popping and exploding and falling off your bike and getting hit by a car or something, you're going to be able to kind of tell, okay, I'm probably getting some adaptation from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, when we're thinking about applying this to, we can talk a little bit about the discussion on this, but 30% in critical power, 8% in VO2. Obviously, if you've been on a bike for 5 years, you're not going to get the same thing in 8 weeks.
Right.
But we know that this is kind of a very specific stimulus, because when you're seeing 30% in critical power versus 8% of VO2, we know the stimulus is higher on the critical power versus other studies when we look at VO2. Right. And we're looking
like
at
the
doing
sprint
these higher
interval
intensities.
training or the high intensity interval
we're
training.
not going to see this on the critical power. We're going to see a much larger impact on the VO2.
Right.
So this is kind of how you look at research and say, like, okay, what am I getting out of this type of work? What is the highest stimulus on? And I think everyone out there would know, like, if you were a sprinter, you're probably not going to raise your FTP that much by going out there and doing 60-meter sprints.
Right.
There's a very specific.
Yeah, it all comes back to the novelty of the stimulus and the specificity of the stimulus, right? Like, if you are truly looking at, like, you can get a long way if you're an untrained individual. You can get a long way by doing, like, what I would say is like fairly polarized training, right? Like a lot of zone 2 and then a lot of high intensity stuff. But eventually, I think, if you're trying to eke out, like small improvements, say in critical power or FTP or whatever you're using as that like balance point between, maintainable and non, then you need to do more specific work at that, like speed or power output. And I think so just like anecdotally, I've had I was kind of doing something similar where I would do like really easy days like in the mountains and stuff like that. I was training for some Spartan races and some trail runs. So I'd go, like really easy days out into the mountains, and they weren't really easy, right? It's like 4 hours of like grinding, like doing like 5,000 feet of vert. But, relatively speaking, to maintain 4 hours, you have to go pretty easy. And then I would come back and I would do, like in the mornings, I would do like sprints on the treadmill. And I was always wondering, when I got to these, like, say, Spartan races or trail races or other things like that, like, why I would start to cramp up after, essentially doing, running at that borderline of, FTP, like sustainable, non-sustainable for 2 hours. I would always start to cramp up, and I'm like, why the heck is that happening? And it's because my body wasn't prepared to do that, because I wasn't doing any, of that, like, say, zone 3, like threshold training. And, time and time again, we see, like, oh, you have to do polarized training, and then you get into the beta pyramidal versus polarized. And we can go into that maybe later. But again, I think that's a very important distinction to make, is if you want to see improvements in your CP, the best way to probably do that is train at CP, or a little bit below, or a little bit above. Like, you have a little bit of wiggle room within there.
That's the thing, is like, I hear a lot on FTP training and critical power training, and there's a lot of specificity around a specific percentage of it for this long. don't focus. Like, yes, you should have a rough estimate, but guess what? Your FTP is going to be different pretty much every single day. Like your time to exhaustion is going to be different every day. Your actual FTP is going to be different every day. Same with your critical power. It's going to be slightly different unless you're like Kipchoge or someone that's been, doing this at the highest degree for like 20 years. And it's like, yeah, if I, it's going to be fairly narrow for him. It's not going to be too much of a change. So finding where you're getting a good stimulus, for example, let's just think about like the classical, like two times 20 FTP training with like a few minutes break in between. If you're 100% of FTP, technically, yeah, that should be a good stimulus. But some days 100%, maybe you can go above that. Maybe you can push that 20 minutes out to 22, 24. So this is where paying attention to RPE and understanding, okay, the shifts in physiology that's kind of happening, whether it's, you're responding well to the training, your base is up at a different time of the year. Just really pay attention to RPE. Don't just go for the number. Because I've seen people drive themselves into the ground by trying to hit, oh, I had to do this today, and this was my FTP, and my FTP was set too high, or my critical power was way off because I used one of the 3 different calculations that overestimated or underestimated. So yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty good, kind of wrap up on that specific study. Which one did you want to go into next?
I think the next one that kind of caught my eye was maximal lactate steady state as a training stimulus. So this like kind of piggybacks off of that.
Yeah.
But some of their findings were a little interesting. So again, these guys this is pretty cool. So these guys are actually out of United Kingdom, but I think Andrew Philp works in Australia now. And he's actually doing I saw him talk at the International Biochemistry of Exercise conference, and he's doing stuff with like mitophagy and mitochondrial turnover in response to like exercise and high fat feeding and stuff like that. So it's really crazy to see his name on this with a very applied physiology paper, and now to see what he's doing. Anyways, so with this paper, let me just kind of get my bearings a little bit. So they took 14 people, 14 healthy individuals again, so not, highly trained or anything like that. And they determined lactate threshold, VO2 max, running velocity at maximal lactate steady state. They said they had a control period of 4 weeks. So they didn't have a sedentary control group, but they did have, I don't think they had a sedentary control group, but they did have either continuous training or high intensity interval training. And the continuous training were 2 sessions per week at the velocity of maximal lactate steady state. So very similar to, FTP critical power. We don't need to argue the minutia of like the differences right now, but maybe at some point. Or they did 2 sessions of 3-minute repetitions. So it was a 3-minute repetition at 5 kilometers per hour above, and then 0.5 kilometers per hour above, and then 0.5 kilometers an hour below maximal lactate steady state. And it doesn't say how long, at least in the abstract. So let me go down to the meat of the paper. Yeah, 3-minute repetitions above. Each session began at a 21-minute duration and extended. Okay, so for the intervals, they kind of just fluctuated between above maximal lactate steady state and below, just very slightly. And they were running on a treadmill, and they were trying to see what the what the changes to performance variables were before and after training. And if we look at figure 1, running velocity at lactate threshold, what increased in both the continuous training and the interval training to the same extent. It's interesting. It's like there was one person, and I mean, this kind of goes to it. One person who was the fastest,
Mhm.
had no change in their lactate,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
13 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
So maybe that wasn't enough of a stimulus for them to actually improve, but everybody else did.
Mhm.
And then they looked at, what is that, mean lactate concentration during minutes 10 to 30 during their maximal lactate steady state test. So yeah, pre to post, they showed a decrease in mean lactate concentrations, and that was regardless of the control or the intermittent training group, or like the interval group. But their new maximal lactate steady state determination, maybe just the continuous group, had higher maximal lactate steady state that they were able to reach. So they were up to like 4.5 millimolar, whereas
Mhm.
the intermittent training group didn't show that much of an increase. So yeah, so then what they did, so they wanted to see how long you could maintain that speed
Mhm.
of maximal lactate steady state. So they just clamped the treadmill at that maximal lactate steady state, and then they just saw how far or how long people could run. And what they showed is that there was no difference actually in the amount of time that you could
Mhm.
run at your maximal lactate steady state. So even
Yeah.
though MLSS increased
Mhm.
over the training period, the amount of time that you could still run at that maximal lactate steady state was the exact same, which
Mhm.
in my mind's eye isn't really surprising,
Mhm.
because it should be um, the same physiological stress.
Yeah.
So, it's not
Because it's a
like,
marker. Yeah.
yeah, it's not like
Yeah.
you're automatically going to go from, like, being able to ride at your FTP for, an hour to
Mhm.
riding at your FTP if you're increasing your FTP
Yeah.
to like 90 minutes. Like
Yeah.
that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. That's where, like, I know that this is something that's talked about a lot when talking about FTP, is like people increasing the duration that they spend at their FTP. And to me, I always wonder how well they're testing their FTP. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there is some people where they actually will be able to spend more time at their FTP, right? And like one of the papers we're going to talk about next year, which is with Mendez and colleagues, we'll kind of talk about that. As you'll see between the two, there is a shift in where people are sitting at, like whether it's 10 minutes, whether it's 5 minutes, but there's definitely a shift. But most of the time, as a rule, like you're not going to see a huge shift in the amount of time you're spending at your FTP if
Mm-hmm.
it's actually your FTP.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you think about it, um, whether you're, a couple watts below or a couple watts above, that's not going to make a huge difference realistically for 40 minutes. Maybe it could, but when we're seeing like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, watts above or below, that will make a huge difference. And I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the times that's why people will see their FTP push out,
Mm-hmm.
right, in terms of time, and they think that their number hasn't gone up because they test again. But this is the big thing about how are you testing your FTP?
Mm-hmm.
Are you trying to pace it on your bike and taking an average power and taking whatever 95% of it, which is actually, if you're not doing a 5 minute all out warm up, you should be taking 91% to 93% of whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just because that's the way Coggin had initially designed it. He had a specific warm up, and a lot of people don't do that 5 minute
Mm-hmm.
all out effort kind of.
Yeah, I didn't even
Um,
know that.
yeah, and that's why you take 95%, and that makes sense. But if you don't do the warm up, it's somewhere closer to 91, 93%. I
Mm-hmm.
think Jose Ramon did a paper on that. Specifically used, I think it was like 11 cycles. Anyways, going down a rabbit hole here. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so if you're on a cycle ergometer, my guess would be is that if if your FTP is pushing out, you're probably actually you've had an increase in FTP. And if you were on a cycle ergometer, you'd probably see that. But if you're going out
Yeah.
and doing a time trial on your bike for 20 minutes, my guess is that, hey, you're going to see some conflated numbers here. You're going to see some
Mm-hmm.
difference, because pacing is such a big portion of understanding FTP. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I just think there's like not been a lot of rigorous study around this specifically.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'll be
Every
interesting.
everything that I come back to is like, So when you see, like research and like the way that research is conducted and everything, um, it's it's good to inform you on what the, say potential,
Hmm.
say adaptations are and those sort of things. Um, but from an applicability standpoint, I
Hmm.
think that um, it's more important to have a consistent test retest with whatever you're doing, whether that's like body composition measurements,
Hmm.
FTP, VO2 max, anything like that. It's more important
Hmm.
to just stay consistent with that. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter what, like, I mean, it matters a little bit what the device you're using, but
Yeah.
the consistency is going to help to reduce the measurement error, which is what we
Hmm.
want to try to do, is reduce that measurement error, so we're not going from like, you know uh 250 FTP to like 300 just because we did a test in the morning and then we did a test in the afternoon after we're like
Yeah.
fully carbohydrate loaded and those sort of things. So
Yeah.
for all of you like athletes and coaches out there, the recommendation is find a test that works for you and then do it consistently and do it repeatedly, right? Like
Yeah.
every six weeks, every quarter, like, something like that, so that you can truly measure or try to get rid of the noise of variability, with
Yeah.
like everyday stress and all of that.
Yeah.
um
What's the
yeah, so
temperature outside? What's the, yeah, there's so many things,
right.
so many things.
um but that's like, but again, it's like, don't get too um bogged down in like the
Yeah.
exact specifics, right? And
Yeah.
especially with like the FTP training, it's like, so these people, or this group showed that it might be a little bit more beneficial to just do continuous maximal lactate steady state versus going up and down.
Hmm.
But at the same time, both groups had improvements, and they were only
Hmm.
working out, what, 2 times per week? Was that
Hmm.
the so
Yeah, it was little in that study.
yeah, so that's
Off the top of my
not
head.
very many.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that's really the bottom line, is like, uh make sure your tests are repeatable. And this kind of, you know is like, well, if you're a little bit over, if you're a little bit under,
Yeah.
um you're still going to be getting some level of stimulus
Yeah.
because you're close to whatever that estimation is.
Yeah. Let's move into the 6 weeks with like Mendez and colleagues, 6 weeks of aerobic training, because it kind of hammers the same thing that we just kind of seen in this last paper we just talked about. Um, so this is a study where they took two groups of participants, a control group, and then they took a training group, which um, essentially they had the training group perform 6 weeks of aerobic training 3 times per week at their maximal lactate steady state power output. So that power output, that's what they're training at 3 times per week.
Mm-hmm.
So their first session was 24 minutes. And they did that for like the first, I'm pretty sure it was, yeah, the first week they did 24 minutes 3 times a week at that MLSS. And then every week they increased by 3 minutes. So the next week would have been 27 minutes and they went up to 39 minutes, right? And what they found was like the similar kind of results of what we seen in the last study, um, which was the maximal by Philp, or yeah, Andrew Philp. Um, so basically, what they're showing here is there's really no change in the amount of time at maximal lactate steady state, right? We're seeing a very minute, which is kind of negligible in terms of science. So what we see here on figure 2 is there's actually quite a difference in how these individuals are spread out on the chart.
Mm-hmm.
So from post training, their points at time to fatigue are actually spread out differently. So there is going to be a minute difference at the time that they're spending there. But when
Mm-hmm.
we look at research, we're saying mean value, there's no difference. But
Right.
for some people, you might actually gain quite a bit because there's a few people that jumped up more than at least 10 minutes.
Yeah.
There's 3 people I'm seeing there that are more than 10 minutes for sure.
Yeah.
So, that's a big difference. 10 minutes at MLSS, and this is actual MLSS where they're testing, several 30-minute trials at that, maximal lactate to make sure that they're not seeing any increase in lactate.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit to understand that, there's going to be some individual variability. But again, specificity is the key. Specificity is the key. They made, great gains in their watt peak at, their incremental test and also their MLSS. So they went from, let's just see here, 150 to 171, for 6 weeks. That's pretty good. So obviously when we're talking about this stuff, don't get too bogged down in the weeds. It's super simple. Like we said before, spend some time at this pace, and generally the best way to do it is chunk things up when you start. Just like when we talked about micro intervals for VO2 max, chunk it up. Who cares? Guess what? 5 minutes is probably not the best stimulus for, training your FTP, but just to get used to that pace and not fry yourself and get used to what you're going to be doing. Who cares if you spend one training session splitting up, 40 minutes of work into 5-minute segments?
Yeah.
So that's always my first go-to with anyone. Like when I trained my mother to run a half marathon, we started off with like literally 2 minutes of running. You know what I mean? And we just kept chunking those together more and more and more to the point where, 30, 40 minutes is nothing, right? At that pace. So just no matter who you are, I think it's always best to, start somewhere close to the amount of work you want to do and just chunk that up more.
Yeah.
And then, then kind of separate them and make them longer and then add more time. Generally don't start off by increasing your power, every other week. That's a mistake I see a lot of people run into, whether it's, weight training, whether it's whatever. If you're not getting enough repetitions in, not getting enough time spent at that portion of training intensity, you're probably doing yourself a disservice and you're not going to gain the most you probably could out of that.
I think, and I feel like I've said this on the podcast before, but if you're trying specifically to increase critical power, it's important to exercise close to it. If you're slightly below that critical power, but that gives you a little bit more confidence and peace of mind to be able to complete that, that's probably better than being slightly over, because anything over critical power. So the whole point, right, of measuring, like lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, critical power, whatever it is to find that delineation, that tipping point to where the system starts to fall apart. And you're going to make it a lot harder on yourself if you're always working at a place where that system is falling apart versus where it is actually maintainable. Yes, you're probably not going to stress the system as much if you're over critical power, but if you're at critical power or a little bit below it, you're still going to be stressing the system and pushing it to adapt to a point where, hopefully then, after like 2 or 3 weeks, you start to string together, like maybe 20 minutes with 2 minutes rest and then another 20 minutes at your FTP or maybe a little bit under that. And then you're like, oh my gosh, like I had to say 300 watts seems easy now. 250 watts seems super easy now for me. So now what I can do is I can start taking those 20-minute chunks and maybe modulating a little bit higher, maybe being like, oh, let's go 5 watts above and see how I feel. Measure your RPE at the, beginning, middle, and end. And again, that sort of pace for most of us should be something that is sustainable for 40 minutes to an hour. Yes, it's going to be hard, but like it shouldn't be the same feeling as, just like an all out, like a 30-second sprint that's like repeated over and over and over. So again, specificity, and then progressive overload. Get the amount of time you need or you want to get, like, say time under tension. That's what they would say in the strength training. Build up to that. And then from there, start to, progressively overload and increase, like power output, but don't go crazy with it because it's not necessary.
This is where this whole concept started with Ostrand, and like, understanding, oh yeah, you actually get lower lactate levels if you chunk it up this way versus, these big, longer, harder. And the same with Veronica Brillat, like the whole 30-30 thing that became popular. And, everything else related to micro intervals was like, oh yeah, it's actually easier. Like the RPE is easier. Veronica Brillat showed that, oh, we can actually spend more time here, right? Because the RPE is, easier generally for the athlete. They don't feel like they're getting as cooked, but it doesn't mean that the stimulus is as strong as it would be if you were putting it up. It depends. It all depends on what you're training, what you're doing. But the best rule of thumb always is just chunk it up. Let your ego go. Who cares about how long you stood at an interval? Being able to do more intervals in the run of a year because you didn't overcook yourself and get sick. Is the guy that's going to win versus the guy that, spent a bunch of time trying to hammer out, oh, I need to get the best adaptation right from the beginning and do 4 minutes or 3 minutes of VO2 max intervals.
And I think for some of us, especially, those who are, self-coached, I'm speaking from experience here. We have a tendency to think we can do more than we actually can, or more than we can realistically take on and recover from. So that's why my recommendation is always go slightly easier. Whether it's I just had a post about like zone 2 training for CrossFit athletes. It's like, sorry, my dog just made a weird noise. So apologies. So I just made a post about zone 2 training for CrossFit athletes. And this was after talking to the coach at the owner of my CrossFit gym. He was like, dude, like, what am I like, how am I supposed to measure and do zone 2 training? I was like, well, I mean, like, my recommendation is like, he doesn't train with power. He doesn't really train with heart rate, like other things like that. He's like, like, what should I be feeling? And I was like, well, like the typical recommendation is the talk test, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you should be able to, like have a conversation, but still have to breathe like every sentence. And that's generally a good estimate.
VT1, right? Ventilation. And that's the change in ventilation. So talking.
Exactly.
Right?
So I told him that, and he was like, well, I don't really understand that too much because, like, I'm not going to be talking to anybody. He just, throws on his metal music. And Derek, I hope this is okay that I'm talking about you. So he's not really going to be talking. He was like, well, what if I thought about it like this? Like, this is, zone 2 should be something, it's like, if I do 30 minutes of it, like, I could just jump right back on and do another 30 minutes of it. I was like, yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And I always recommend going a little bit less because, if you stay, or you have less of a risk of developing disease or getting sick, getting injured, other things like that, if you're under what the target is versus if you're always kind of pushing that knife edge. And consistency wins out. There's a reason why Eliud Kipchoge is one of the best runners in the world. And it's because he's consistently trained for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
So take some plays out of their playbook.
Yeah.
And if you always find, at the beginning of your season, you're super fired up and motivated to get to training, and then by the end of it, you're super burnt out, there's probably something to say that you're either doing too much volume, too much intensity, under recovering, or a combination of all of those. So that kind of takes us away from, threshold training. But to get back to that, the recommendation again is, it's really cool to read all these like, studies and all of that. But you have to remember that the group probably doesn't apply to you. A lot of these are like college age males who have never trained before. And, that's just a limitation of the field. But you can still get ideas for, like the types of training you could possibly be doing. Like Matt, what you were recommending is like, chunk things up. Like you can still, get really close to critical power training. You can train at critical power and then you can relax, and then you can train at critical power and then you can relax, and you can just keep doing that until you accumulate your time. That's going to be a good stress.
Yeah.
Especially if you've never done that before.
Yeah.
And you can progress it and all of that. And it's about staying consistent, because that's what's going to give you the best chance of, showing up to that starting line and having your best effort in your best race.
Yeah.
So
yeah, let's like, I want to give some like hard, like, because people are like, well, what do I do? Because there's some people that are just like, no, just tell me what could I do. So I'm just going to come off the top of my head, but these are things that I kind of have set in my head for any modality that tend to work fairly well, whether it's critical power, FTP, whether it's threshold. So we'll start with like FTP, right? Whether that's your FTP and cycling or FTP and running. Like the way I always start is 5-minute intervals. Yeah, okay, 5 minute. You're not getting anything from the threshold there. It's like, let's just start with 5 and just get used to that pace. Let's get used to doing that pace for an extended period of time. So start with about 40 minutes accumulated work of 5-minute intervals. That's great. That's a ton of work spent at threshold. And at 5 minutes, that's
that's rest that you would recommend?
So anywhere from like generally for any type of work that's interval based, I don't go over 2 minutes. Okay. And this is from something I got from actually Steven Seiler in a research study where they showed like what was self-selected, what was the best interval rest recovery time that athletes took, and it was generally around like 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes, right? Compared to like optimal what they found through actually researching like what seems to show the best, not getting too off the beaten path, essentially, with 6-minute rests. And so regardless of the interval, it's generally 2 minutes, unless it's a super extreme interval. Maybe push that out to 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, like a VO2 max interval, like where you're doing mile repeats or something like
exactly. So or sprint interval training. But FTP, it's generally like 2-minute rest, and I start with 5 minutes. And like, you'll be surprised of like doing 40 minutes with 5-minute intervals. It feels like you're actually not even really doing, it feels like really easy tempo training, kind of, in that lower kind of sweet spot. And then what you can do is you can start to add an interval or two, and then start to chunk those together. After a couple of weeks, you chunk them together. So you're doing, the same amount of work, 40 minutes, but now you're splitting it up by 10. So 4 10-minute intervals. And then you're doing 2 20-minute intervals at FTP, right? And you'll see that kind of that FTP go up and out because you're spending a lot of time at that specific zone, right? Powerlifters lift heavy weights, they get better at lifting heavy weights. Bodybuilders, it's a different thing. But so then let's talk about critical power now, because if you're using critical power as your measure, which a lot of people do, it's a great, gives you a profile along with it too. Is like, okay, am I more endurance based or more, sprinter? This is the same thing, but I start generally at like, 3 to 4 minute intervals at critical power or a little bit above critical power, right? So the same thing, you're getting 2 minutes rest in between, but critical power is, you're generally only going to be able to hold your critical power for 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
If you're like an elite, you're going to be holding it for, 30 minutes, above 30 minutes, but most people really can't hold their critical power for more than 20 minutes. Some people even less.
Well, and I think that's something that's super interesting about, at least this is something we can learn from the literature, right? Is that a lot of people, critical power is supposed to be this like maximal oxidative potential of your body.
Yeah.
But then, so that should be ideally maintained 30 to 60 minutes. But then in all actuality, when we test that, it's like, I can't remember the specific numbers, but I think it was like 22 to 30 minutes is like pushing it. And if
Depending
you truly
on
do get a critical, exactly. Depending on the study. And if you truly do get a measure of your critical power, like uh, you you should be pretty darn exhausted at the end of
Yeah.
that test. So it's like that's pushing it. 22 minutes. Like I think the best I ever did was I got around 22 minutes. Maintaining critical power, and I was wrecked afterwards. So that's a good recommendation though.
Yeah. And with critical power, I wouldn't tend to do anything larger than 10-minute intervals. Like you can, but I just don't see the trade-off. You dig quite deep. Like if you're at critical power or somewhere around your critical power, if you're going more than 10 minutes, you're digging pretty deep into the hole there. Like that's and that's the thing. There's like this exponential kind of stress. It's like as you start to go up in the intensity, the more time you're spending at these zones, like they're super advantageous, but it's, you can sit there and do, 5-minute intervals at critical power for quite some time, right? You can keep repeating that, but you have to kind of pull the switch off. So work up to about 20 to 30 minutes of time at critical power, starting at that, what I said, anywhere from like 3 maybe minutes if you really wanted to push it down the low side, 5 minutes to start with, and then push it up to about 10, and get about anywhere from 20, 30, maybe even 40 minutes if you're really keen, really fit.
And if you are focusing on the nutritional aspect of things as well, like make sure that you're replenishing glucose and all of that after your workouts, especially if you're gonna try to do these like multiple times a week. And so that was my next question, is like, how many times per week would you recommend? Typically with endurance coaches, right, it's like one time a week, and then you have like maybe a little bit of shorter interval training, and then you have a long run, right? Those are kind of your 3 quality sessions per week.
For like the way I look at it, you can take a more conjugate approach where you keep a lot of these things in year round. Some people just train like this year round. I think it can work for some athletes. Like I'm not biased in saying one system works better than the other. There's the opposite approach where you just hammer like high blocks of these things throughout the year, whether it's, at the beginning of the season, or you're getting more general to specific, whatever the way you're going to organize this. And I generally think that everyone's going to respond to these different, whether it's conjugate or block periodization, whatever, everyone's going to respond differently to them. Also how that athlete likes doing that. Maybe they hate high intensity work, and they're a sucker for just going out there and building those base miles. So doing a 6-week block of this might be too much for them psychologically, and they just get disgusted with training. Everything I'm saying here is caveated. Like I'm giving you broad, like, hey, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe for like, the reason I'm doing that is because realistically you have to see how you're responding. Whatever you're going to choose for your recovery response to understanding how you're recovering, whether it's your heart rate on the training the next day, whether it's your Mox-T signal on your vastus lateralis the next day during your warm-up, whether it's your HRV, whether it's grip testing, whether it's the Rusco orthostatic heart rate test, whatever you're going to choose, pay attention to how you respond to these things. Do a couple weeks, see how you feel, see if your immune system's not depleting to the point where you're
gonna get sick.
But so I would say if you're doing them in a block, anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week. Critical power, I would generally maybe only do 2 a week, because those are pretty intense. That's ball busting work. FTP I find is handled a little bit better, especially for cyclists. For runners, you're pounding the pavement, so you have to take that into consideration. Maybe a little bit less for runners, maybe 2 times a week. But if you're doing it in that block style, that's how I generally approach it. No more than 3 times a week. Now, if you're doing it year round, once a week is fine. Right? If you're an ultra runner, it's even a different story. It's once every 3 weeks, once every 2 weeks.
Right. Because the specificity you don't necessarily race at critical power when you're doing a 100 and whatever mile race. But I totally agree with that. I think that at least for me, if I knew that I had to do like 3 FTP style workouts a week,
hmm
I don't think I'd be able to cover from, like those sort of efforts. And maybe it's because I am
Yeah.
going too hard most of the time.
Yeah.
But generally, if I have like a hard effort, I need like, 2, maybe 3 days of
hmm
like, pretty easy stuff.
Yeah.
And so I have a tendency, right, to do a little bit more of like, I like the long workout because, that's not really a pace-based workout in my mind's eye. It's just getting out there and accumulating volume.
hmm
So I love that because that you can play with like recovery a little. I love the kind of short punchy sprints. I'm not good at like I'm not very non-aerobic in terms of like my athletic build. So
hmm
I can always gain benefit from those.
Yeah.
Um and then I also like, like the challenge of, like a kind of threshold type workout, VO2 max style workout, like those sort of things. So that's like if I were designing a program for myself, I would
Yeah.
do something like that and then modulate, like the distance on the long run, maybe a little bit of the speed sometimes. I would
Yeah.
definitely change the intervals on like the sprint interval day and then,
Yeah.
do something throughout the year where I'm kind of modulating the FTP or the CP or, like whatever it is, but a little bit more of like the quote unquote tempo work.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
See,
that's just
that's
what
like,
works for me.
yeah. And I'm the opposite. Like I can handle more. I'm more of a fast twitch guy, right? Like I've
Mm-hmm.
always have been. Um, and the thing with me is if I do any type of VO2 max training, any type of like high intensity training, I'm fried, dude. Like my nervous system is
Mm-hmm.
fried. Everything's fried because I'm going to a fairly deep place. And it takes me a long time to recover. And we see that with some of the research out there, like with
Mm-hmm.
Bellinger and other guys like that.
Yeah.
It does take a little bit longer for those type 2 fibers to recover, especially with when we're talking about endurance. Um, so yeah, like tempo is much easier for me to accumulate, and that's why I always give, maybe you don't start at 40 minutes of work for your tempo. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you start at 30 minutes with 5-minute intervals, then push to 10-minute 3 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you push in. That's why everything I'm saying here is so loosely, but I'm giving you a template, and depending on your training age, your years of spending and cycling or running or whatever it is, and you kind of take all these little aspects, just like the Maffetone method, where he's like, training age, injury history, all these things kind of affect your score, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is the same kind of concept. You have to take all your factors into consideration and start somewhere, see how you responded to it. Was it too much? Was it right on? Was it too
Mm-hmm.
little? And keep making notes. That's one thing I'll give to people is, you may hate keeping a training diary or hate keeping a training journal. Um, but when you actually write things down about how a session felt,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the words on the paper, and I generally think that using a pen actually works better than putting it somewhere in your notes in your cloud, which you might never look at again. But when you
Right.
do the act of writing, and there's research on this as well, and you look at that and you see it, and then you go do it the next day and you look at that and you're reflecting on it, you tend to actually be a little bit more present in your process of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
When you're just kind of like, oh, I just completed the intervals and that's my workout for the day, don't think about it again. Oh, it's up again, it's Thursday, I'm doing my intervals again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you will heed the best gains and adaptations, because um, you're not paying attention to your response. You're not paying attention to your effort and getting kind of the edges that you could be, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really bad for this most of my life. I just write the numbers down, but I wouldn't think much about it. And yeah, I think you'll gain a lot from just paying attention to
Yeah.
the session, specifically with these high intensity sessions.
Yeah.
Moderate.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And as you were saying that, I was like, you know what, if I am going to get more serious about my training and stuff, and I'm probably not going to do it for a little while, but I definitely think that it is important. So I'm actually buying, like a little moleskin journal right now,
Dude,
because
nice.
I definitely need it. And I've done in the past where, you know, like I'll wake up and I'll write, you know, like do like gratitude journaling, and then I'll write what my
Hmm.
workouts were and how they felt. And then,
Yeah.
you know, reflect on that either the next day or like something like that. And it really does, you know, kind of, again, bring you back into like the present moment of
Yeah.
like, man, like I crushed it yesterday, and after the workout, I, you know, felt like I crushed it. And then you come
Yeah.
back the next day and you're like, holy crap, my legs are, you know, feeling so tight and, you know, like
Yeah.
so heavy and all of that sort of
Mhm.
stuff. And if you don't have anything to reinforce that kind of like, yeah, you just went hard yesterday, so you don't
Yeah.
have to go hard again today. Like it's
Yeah.
okay to go easy. You know, it's one of those things where it's just another kind of reminder
Yeah.
of, you know, like it's okay to modulate. And again, I'll say it and I'll say it and I'll say it. Consistency is going to beat the best training program, the most optimal, whatever, over time, because if you know, just get like half a percentage better every single
Hmm.
day,
Hmm.
eventually that's going to exponentially, you know, start to happen and get better, as opposed to like, you know, there's so many people who come to CrossFit and will go 6 days a week, you know, for the first
Hmm.
2 weeks, and then
Hmm.
they'll just stop coming because
Yeah.
it's too hard. They're not recovering. They got
Yeah.
sick, like other things like that. And it's something that I've noticed and I've talked to people about. It's like, um, you pretty much know who's gonna last and who's not, just based on
Yeah.
how many times they come in the first 2 weeks, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so all that to be said, you know, it's, again, it's about becoming more aware. And I know we talk a lot about the research on here, but
Yeah.
from the practical applicability standpoint, it's about maintaining consistency, and it's about, you know, becoming aware of how, you know, your body is adapting and how your body is feeling and all that sort of stuff. So
Yeah.
not to get too philosophical. um
No, that's a great tangent.
yeah.
I like when I think about, you become a lot of times more, and it sounds counterintuitive, you can become a lot more present by being more reflective a lot of times. Like
Mhm.
when you spend more time being reflective, you're tuning in to the things that you were feeling in that present. And when
Right.
you're thinking about those things, actually, one of the craziest reflections that process of reflection that I learned about was in guiding, when I was taking my guiding courses for like climbing and stuff like that, mountaineering, all that stuff.
Mhm.
Um, one of the head guides had us like go buy a notebook, and he said, every day what you're going to do is take in, uh, you know, your whole day, and what you're going to do is write down, when did you put your client in most danger?
Mm.
You know, when did you put, what was the moment that you did that? What was the, you know, it might not have been something that was extreme, but you're always going to take risk when you're climbing.
Mhm.
And, you know, oh, maybe the, you know, that anchor I made was a little bit too far away from the previous anchor, and, you know, lost communication. That could have been you know, that could have been bad if something happened. And
Mhm.
then what was one thing that you did really well that you implemented? You know, how did you feel today? How was the weather? What, and when you go into this detailed process, the
Mhm.
way you start looking at climbing is completely different.
Yeah.
You know
Well,
what I
and
mean?
then
It's
too, it's like
completely different.
you initially reflect retroactively,
Yeah.
but then since that starts getting engraved or ingrained in your mind, you
Yeah.
start to then notice it as it's occurring. And
Yeah.
then hopefully from there, you
Exactly.
can start to, you know, tweak what's going on. It's like, oh, well, you
Yeah.
know, last time I noted that I set that anchor
Yeah.
too high. So now this
Yeah.
time I'm going to set it a little bit lower because, you know, that's going to reduce the risk of injury or, you know,
Yeah.
something bad happening. And
Yeah.
it's the same thing with training, right? Is like, you know, there are some people who just like, you know, record training journals for their entire lives.
Mhm.
But I think getting to a point where, like, there is a point where you could be pretty good at, you know, knowing and modulating and everything in the moment based on how you're
Mhm.
feeling, other things like that, you know, like your
Mhm.
inputs from, you know, your whoop, your power output, your heart rate, like
Yeah.
all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where we want to get to, but
Mhm.
you got to start somewhere. And I think, you know, that's where a lot of people, you know, really like the, well, what's a good workout to start with? what can I start with? And, then how can I progress it? So yeah. And I think on that note, I mean, that we've touched on a lot of stuff today, but the threshold training, I think, is pretty important, especially if you're going to do anything, that's between 30 minutes and 2 hours. I think it's really important to do some sort of threshold training, or at least, have it incorporated into your training throughout the year, if not a block, or, something along those lines.
Yeah. General to specific as you're getting closer, if your race pace is at that threshold, spend more time there. If you're an ultra marathon runner, if it's further away, do it in the beginning. This was great. So hopefully you guys got something out of that. Hopefully, you may have gleaned, a new way of looking at something, or maybe a protocol of approaching something, critical power or FTP, whatever it is. So if you liked what you heard today, just share it with a friend, or share it with someone that you're talking about with threshold training. That's great. Great way to make the podcast grow. If you want to follow Phil on Instagram, he's at critical 02. And I'm at resilience HPC. And we post on there as much as we can. Phil more so than I. And
if you have questions, feel free to DM us as well. If something wasn't clear in the podcast, or if there's a topic that you want to hear, we love talking about this stuff, and we love trying to answer people's questions. So reach out to us and let us know.
We've been getting great feedback and great questions in the DMs. So folks, that's all for today, and enjoy.
Catch you in the next one.